The leather belt cracked against bare skin with a sound that echoed through the cramped boarding house room like thunder before a storm. Sarah Campbell pressed her face into the thin pillow, biting down hard to stifle the cry that threatened to escape her lips. The second blow landed across her shoulders, and she felt the familiar burn of torn flesh. Behind her, the man she'd been forced to call husband for 3 torturous months breathed heavily with exertion and something darker. "You'll learn your place before you leave this house," William Cox snarled, his voice thick with whiskey and rage. "No mountain man wants a wife who can't keep her mouth shut and her opinions to herself." Sarah's fingers gripped the worn bed sheets until her knuckles turned white. The third strike fell across her back, and she felt warm blood begin to trickle down her spine. She thought of the letter folded carefully in her traveling bag. The correspondence from Jeremy Murphy, a stranger in Colorado territory who'd agreed to marry her sight unseen, a man who couldn't possibly be worse than the monster standing behind her now. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible. "The stage leaves at dawn. It leaves when I say it leaves, another crack of leather against flesh. And you'll carry these marks as a reminder of what happens to women who think they can run from their duties." The pain was nothing new. For months, William had used his fists, his belt, and his cruel words to break her spirit. But tomorrow she would board that westbound stage, and these wounds would heal. The scars on her soul might take longer, but at least she would be free of this place. Free of him. Hours later, as William's snores filled the small room, Sarah lay on her stomach, feeling the sting of fresh welts across her back and shoulders. She stared at the window where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the skyline. In a few hours, she would begin the long journey to Colorado territory, to a man who knew nothing of her past, nothing of the hell she was fleeing. Jeremy Murphy's letters had been brief but kind, practical but not unkind. He needed a wife to help with his homestead in the mountains. She needed escape from a life that had become unbearable. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story of survival and unexpected hope is just beginning to unfold in the harsh wilderness of the Colorado Territory. Sarah had answered his advertisement in the newspaper with trembling hands, her letter carefully crafted to present herself as a suitable wife without revealing the desperate circumstances that drove her to seek marriage with a complete stranger. She'd told him she was 22, which was true. She'd mentioned her ability to cook, sew, and manage a household, which was also true. She hadn't mentioned the bruises that painted her skin in shades of purple and yellow, or the way she flinched whenever a man raised his voice. The morning came too slowly and too quickly at once. Sarah rose before William woke, moving carefully to avoid aggravating the fresh wounds on her back. She dressed in her best traveling dress, a simple brown wool that had seen better days but was clean and modest. Over it, she wore a shawl that concealed the worst of the damage to her shoulders and neck. Her belongings fit into a single carpet bag: 3 dresses, undergarments, a few personal items that had belonged to her mother, and the small bundle of letters from Jeremy Murphy tied with a faded ribbon. It wasn't much to show for 22 years of life, but it was everything she owned in the world. William stirred as she lifted the bag, and Sarah froze. His bloodshot eyes opened and fixed on her with the predatory focus she'd learned to fear. "Going somewhere?" His voice was rough with sleep and the lingering effects of whiskey. "The stage," she said quietly. "As we agreed." He sat up slowly, and Sarah saw him wince as the movement aggravated his own hangover. "Come here!" Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to take a step closer to the bed. William reached out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into the delicate bones until she gasped. "Remember what I taught you," he said, his grip tightening. "Remember your place. That mountain man might be fool enough to take you sight unseen, but he won't keep you if you give him trouble." "I understand," Sarah whispered. He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. "Get out of my sight." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her bag and fled the boarding house, her heart pounding as she made her way through the early morning streets to the stage depot. The cool air stung the wounds on her back, but she welcomed the discomfort as a reminder that she was still alive, still fighting. The westbound stage sat waiting in the dusty yard, its driver checking the harnesses while a few passengers milled about nearby. Sarah approached the ticket window with hands that shook only slightly, presenting the money she'd saved coin by coin over the past months. The clerk barely glanced at her as he handed over her ticket. Colorado territory, he said in a bored voice. Long journey, miss. You sure you're prepared for mountain living? I'm sure, Sarah replied, though she wasn't sure of anything except her desperate need to escape. The other passengers were a mixed group, a businessman in a wrinkled suit who kept checking his pocket watch, an elderly woman traveling to visit family, and a young man who looked like he might be heading west to seek his fortune in the mining camps. None of them paid Sarah much attention, which suited her perfectly. As the stage rolled out of town, Sarah pressed her face to the window and watched the familiar buildings grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. With each mile that passed, she felt the invisible chains that had bound her to William Cox loosening. The pain in her back was a constant reminder of what she was leaving behind, but it was also proof that she had survived. The journey west was long and uncomfortable. The stage bounced and swayed over rough roads, jarring Sarah's injured back with every pothole and stone. She bit her lip to keep from crying out when the wagon hit a particularly deep rut, sending a spike of pain through her shoulders. The elderly woman who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson noticed Sarah's discomfort on the second day. "Are you feeling unwell, dear?" she asked kindly. "You look quite pale." "Just tired from the journey," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "I'm not accustomed to so much travel." Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically. "It's a hard road to the territories. What takes you to Colorado? Family?" "My husband," Sarah said, the lie coming easier now. He's established a homestead there." "How wonderful. It takes a brave woman to follow her man into the wilderness. I'm sure he'll be grateful to have you by his side." Sarah turned back to the window, unable to meet the older woman's kind eyes. If only she knew the truth. Sarah wasn't brim. She was desperate. She wasn't following love into the wilderness. She was running from cruelty into the unknown. The landscape changed as they traveled west, becoming more rugged and wild with each passing day. Rolling hills gave way to rocky terrain, and eventually the distant peaks of mountains appeared on the horizon. Sarah had never seen mountains before, and despite her pain and uncertainty, she found herself awed by their majesty. On the fourth day, they stopped at a way station to change horses and allow the passengers to stretch their legs. Sarah walked carefully to a small creek that ran behind the station, desperate to wash the dust from her face and hands. The cool water felt wonderful against her skin, but when she tried to splash some on the back of her neck, she winced and pulled her hand away bloody. The wounds from William's belt had reopened during the rough journey, and her dress was sticking to the dried blood on her back. She looked around to make sure she was alone, then carefully lifted her shawl to examine the damage as best she could. What she saw made her stomach turn. The welts were angry and inflamed, some showing signs of infection. "Miss, are you all right?" Sarah spun around to find the young man from the stage standing a few feet away, concern written across his face. She quickly pulled her shawl back into place, her cheeks burning with shame. "I'm fine," she said quickly. Just tired." But the young man had sharp eyes, and Sarah realized he'd seen more than she'd intended. His expression grew troubled. "Miss, if someone hurt you," he began. "No one hurt me," Sarah said firmly. "I fell from a horse before I left home." It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. But the young man was gentleman enough not to press the issue. "If you need help," he said quietly, "or if you need someone to speak for you when we reach your destination." "Thank you," Sarah interrupted, "but I'll be fine." She hurried back to the stage before he could say anything else, her heart pounding. The last thing she needed was complications, questions, or well-meaning interference. She just needed to reach Jeremy Murphy and hope that he was the kind of man his letter suggested. The final leg of the journey took them high into the mountain, where the air grew thin and cold. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to ignore the constant ache in her back and the growing dread in her stomach. What if Jeremy Murphy took one look at her and decided he'd made a mistake? What if he was as cruel as William had been? What if she'd traded one prison for another? The stage finally rolled to a stop in a small mountain town that seemed to consist of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a few scattered buildings. The driver climbed down and began unloading luggage. "End of the line, folks," he called out. "Those continuing on to Denver can catch the next stage tomorrow morning." Sarah climbed down from the stage on unsteady legs, her carpet bag clutched tightly in her hand. She looked around the dusty street, searching for a man who might be Jeremy Murphy. Her stomach twisted with nerves as she realized she had no idea what he looked like. His letters had been practical affairs, focused on the necessities of frontier life rather than personal details. Sarah Campbell? She turned to find a tall man approaching her, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps 35 or 40, with broad shoulders and hands that spoke of hard work. His clothes were clean but worn, and there was something in his bearing that suggested both strength and restraint. "Mr. Murphy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jeremy Murphy," he confirmed, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Colorado territory." He moved to take her bag, and Sarah instinctively stepped back. The sudden movement sent a sharp pain through her back, and she couldn't quite suppress the small gasp that escaped her lips. Jeremy's eyes sharpened, and Sarah realized her reaction hadn't gone unnoticed. But he simply gestured toward a wagon waiting nearby. "It's a fair ride to the homestead," he said. "We should get it started before the weather turns." Sarah nodded and followed him to the wagon, trying to move normally despite the pain that lanced through her with every step. Jeremy helped her up onto the seat with gentle hands, and she was grateful that he didn't try to make conversation as they left the town behind. The mountain trail was rough and winding, carved into the side of steep slopes that dropped away into deep valleys. Sarah had never seen country like this, wild and beautiful, and somehow threatening all at once. The silence between them stretched long, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Your letters mentioned you could cook," Jeremy said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Sarah replied, "and tend a garden." "Good. It's a hard life up here, but it's honest work." Sarah glanced at him sideways, trying to read his expression. His profile was stern but not unkind, weathered by sun and wind. There was something solid about him, something that suggested reliability and strength. But she'd been wrong about men before. "Mr. Murphy," she began hesitantly, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for this opportunity. I'll do my best to be a good wife to you." He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she'd said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I'm not looking for gratitude, Miss Campbell. I'm looking for a partner, someone who can share the work and the hardships. If that's something you can do, then we'll get along fine." The wagon rounded a bend, and Jeremy's homestead came into view. It was larger than Sarah had expected, a solid log cabin with a stone chimney and glass windows that caught the afternoon light. There was a barn, a chicken coop, and what looked like the beginnings of a vegetable garden. It was simple but well-maintained, speaking of a man who took pride in his work. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and she meant it. Jeremy pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and climbed down. He came around to help Sarah down, and this time she didn't flinch away from his touch. His hands were gentle as they steadied her, and she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that might have been kindness. "Let me show you around," he said, shouldering her carpet bag. The inside of the cabin was neat and spare, furnished with handmade furniture that was sturdy rather than elegant. There was a large stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and a table with 2 chairs. A ladder led to a loft area that Jeremy explained would be her private space until they were properly married. "The preacher comes through once a month," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "He'll be here again in 2 weeks." Sarah nodded, relief flooding through her at the confirmation that she would have time to adjust before the marriage ceremony. 2 weeks to heal, to prepare herself for whatever came next. "I'll do my best to earn my keep in the meantime," she said. Jeremy set her bag down near the ladder and turned to face her. "Miss Campbell, I want to be clear about something. I'm not a man who believes in forcing anyone to do anything they don't want to do. If you decide this isn't the life for you, I'll see that you get safely back to wherever you came from." The kindness in his voice nearly brought tears to Sarah's eyes. When was the last time a man had spoken to her with such consideration? "Thank you," she whispered, "but I have nowhere else to go." Something flickered in Jeremy's expression at those words, but he simply nodded and moved toward the door. I'll be in the barn tending to the animals, he said. Make yourself at home. There's food in the pantry, and the well is just outside the back door. After Jeremy left, Sarah climbed carefully up to the loft to examine her new living space. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings. A small window looked out over the mountain valley, offering a view that was both beautiful and isolated. Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to truly feel the pain that had been her constant companion for days. Her back was on fire, and she could feel fresh blood seeping through her dress where the wounds had reopened during the wagon ride. She needed to clean and tend to the injuries, but she had no idea how to do so without Jeremy discovering her condition. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses on pegs driven into the log walls. At the bottom of her bag, wrapped carefully in an old petticoat, were the few medical supplies she'd managed to gather before leaving. A small bottle of carbolic acid, some clean rags, and a tin of salve that was supposed to prevent infection. The sound of footsteps on the ladder made her quickly shove the supplies back into her bag. Jeremy's head appeared at the top of the ladder, and Sarah was grateful that she was facing away from him. I thought you might like some fresh water for washing, he said, setting a pitcher and basin on the washstand. Supper will be ready in about an hour. Thank you, Sarah replied, not turning around. She heard him hesitate, and then his voice came again, quieter this time. Miss Campbell, are you injured? Sarah's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? You've been moving carefully since you got off the stage. And he paused as if searching for the right words. There's blood on the back of your dress. Sarah closed her eyes, her worst fear realized. She'd been so careful, but the rough journey had undone all her efforts to conceal the evidence of William's cruelty. I fell, she said weakly, the same lie she'd told the young man on the stage. Miss Campbell, Jeremy's voice was gentle but firm. Turn around. I can't, Sarah whispered, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. You'll send me away. I won't send you away, Jeremy said quietly, but I need to see how badly you're hurt. Sarah remained frozen, caught between shame and the desperate need for help. The wounds were getting worse, not better, and she knew that infection could kill her if left untreated. Please, Jeremy said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah believe he truly meant to help, not harm. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned to face him. Jeremy's expression was carefully controlled, but she saw his jaw tighten when he took in her tear-stained face and the way she held herself. Show me, he said simply. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled her shawl away from her shoulders and turned her back to him. She heard his sharp intake of breath and knew he could see the bloodstains that had seeped through her dress. Who did this to you? The question was asked in a voice so cold and controlled that it made Sarah shiver. It doesn't matter, she said quietly. He's far away now. It matters to me. Jeremy's voice carried a note of steel that Sarah had never heard from any man when speaking about her welfare. Show me how bad it is. Sarah's hands shook as she began to unfasten her dress. The fabric had stuck to the wounds in several places, and she gasped in pain as she tried to pull it free. Let me help, Jeremy said, and his hands were infinitely gentle as he helped her ease the dress away from her injured back. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood in her chemise, her back exposed to Jeremy's gaze, and waited for his reaction. She'd seen the wounds in a mirror back at the boarding house, and she knew they were horrific. Angry red welts crossed her shoulders and back, some still oozing blood and others showing the telltale signs of infection. Jesus, Jeremy breathed, and Sarah heard him move closer. Sarah, who did this to you? The use of her first name, spoken with such gentle concern, broke something inside her. The tears came harder now, and she found herself telling him everything. About William Cox and his drunken rages, about the months of beatings and cruel words, about the final night when he'd used his belt to ensure she carried reminders of her place with her to Colorado. Jeremy listened in silence, and when Sarah finally finished speaking, she felt his hands settle gently on her uninjured shoulder. You're safe now, he said quietly. I give you my word that no one will ever hurt you like that again. Sarah wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Still, when Jeremy asked if he could tend to her wounds, she found herself nodding. He was surprisingly gentle for such a large man, cleaning the infected areas with careful precision and applying salve with hands that barely touched her skin. He worked in silence, and Sarah gradually began to relax under his ministrations. "These need to be cleaned twice a day," Jeremy said when he finished. "Some of them are infected, but I think we caught it in time." "I have some carbolic acid," Sarah said quietly, "in my bag." "Good, we'll use that tomorrow." Jeremy helped her ease a clean chemise over her head, taking care not to aggravate the wounds. "You need rest and good food. The healing will take time." Sarah turned to face him, searching his expression for any sign of disgust or rejection. Instead, she found something that looked like protective anger. "Mr. Murphy," she began. "Jeremy," he corrected. "And you don't need to say anything. Just focus on getting better." Over the following days, Jeremy proved to be a man of his word. He tended Sarah's wounds with gentle efficiency, never making her feel ashamed of her injuries or asking questions that would force her to relive painful memories. He cooked simple but nourishing meals and insisted she rest while her body healed. Sarah found herself watching Jeremy carefully, looking for signs that his kindness might be a facade. But as the days passed, she began to see that his gentle treatment wasn't an act. He was simply a decent man who believed in treating others with respect and compassion. The cabin felt different with Sarah in it. She couldn't do much physical work while her back healed, but she found small ways to contribute. She mended Jeremy's clothes, organized his pantry, and prepared simple meals when she felt strong enough. It was a quiet, peaceful existence, so different from the chaos and fear she'd known with William. One evening, as Jeremy cleaned her wounds, Sarah finally found the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Why did you answer my letter?" she said quietly. "There must have been other women who responded to your advertisement." Jeremy's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their gentle work. "There were a few," he admitted, "but your letter was different." "How?" "Most of them wrote about what they wanted from a husband. You wrote about what you could offer. It told me something about your character." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this. "What if I'm not the woman you thought I was?" "You're exactly who I thought you were," Jeremy replied. "Strong, brave, and willing to work hard for a better life." "I'm not brave," Sarah protested. "I ran away." "Running away from someone who was hurting you isn't cowardice," Jeremy said firmly. "It's survival. And it took courage to come all the way out here to start over with a stranger." His words settled something inside Sarah that had been restless and afraid since the day she'd answered his advertisement. For the first time in months, she began to believe that she might actually have a future worth living. As her wounds slowly healed, Sarah began to take on more responsibilities around the homestead. She discovered that Jeremy was an excellent cook, but she gradually took over the kitchen duties. She tended the vegetable garden and gathered eggs from the chickens. She learned to milk the cow and helped Jeremy with the endless tasks that kept a mountain homestead running. The work was hard, but it was honest labor that brought its own satisfaction. Sarah found herself growing stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. Jeremy never pushed her to talk about her past, but sometimes in the evenings as they sat by the fire, Sarah found herself sharing small memories. Not the painful ones, but glimpses of the woman she'd been before William Cox had tried to break her spirit. Jeremy listened with genuine interest, and gradually Sarah began to remember who she'd been before fear had defined her existence. 2 weeks after her arrival, the preacher came through town as promised. Jeremy mentioned it casually over breakfast, making it clear that the decision was entirely hers. "Reverend Mitchell will be holding services this Sunday," he said. "If you're ready, we could speak to him about performing the ceremony." Sarah's heart began to race. She'd known this moment would come, but she still felt unprepared. Marriage to Jeremy would make her situation permanent, would close off any possibility of returning to her old life. Not that she wanted to go back, but the finality of it was frightening. "What if I'm not ready?" she asked quietly. "Then we wait," Jeremy replied simply. "There's no rush, Sarah. This has to be your choice." His understanding only made the decision harder. Sarah had expected pressure, demands, perhaps even anger at her hesitation. Instead, Jeremy offered her something she'd never had before, the freedom to choose her own path. That afternoon, Sarah walked alone to a small meadow she'd discovered near the cabin. It was a peaceful place where wildflowers grew in abundance, and the sound of a nearby stream provided a gentle soundtrack. She sat on a fallen log and tried to sort through her conflicted feelings. She thought about the woman she'd been when she'd first married William Cox. Young, naive, full of hope for the future. That woman had been destroyed by months of cruelty and abuse, but perhaps something of her could be salvaged. Perhaps, with Jeremy's patience and kindness, she could become someone new. The sound of footsteps made her look up. Jeremy was approaching through the trees, moving with the quiet grace she'd come to associate with him. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Sarah gestured to the log beside her, and Jeremy sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the play of sunlight on the meadow grass. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah finally spoke, "about the preacher. And I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of you, but of being married again, of what it might mean." Jeremy nodded thoughtfully. "Marriage should be a partnership," he said quietly. "Two people working together toward common goals, supporting each other through hard times. It shouldn't be about one person controlling the other." "Is that what you want?" Sarah asked. "A partnership? It's what I've always wanted," Jeremy replied. "I'm not interested in having a servant or someone who's afraid of me. I want a companion, someone who chooses to be here because she wants to be, not because she has nowhere else to go." Sarah considered his words carefully. The idea of marriage as partnership was so foreign to her experience that it seemed almost impossible. But looking at Jeremy, seeing the genuine respect in his eyes when he looked at her, she began to believe that it might actually be possible. "If we married," she said slowly, "what would you expect from me?" Jeremy was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I'd expect honesty," he said finally. "An effort, not perfection, but genuine effort to build something good together. Beyond that," he shrugged, "we'd figure it out as we went along. And if I wasn't ready for all the aspects of marriage right away." Jeremy's expression softened. "Sarah, I would never force anything on you. When and if you're ready for more than companionship, it will be because you choose it, not because I demand it." The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. The fear that had been gnawing at her since Jeremy first mentioned the preacher began to recede. "I think," she said carefully, "I think I would like to speak to Reverend Mitchell this Sunday." Jeremy smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "I'm glad," he said simply. The wedding ceremony took place the following Sunday in the small church that served the scattered mountain community. Sarah wore her best dress, carefully altered to conceal the fading scars on her back. Jeremy had somehow procured a bouquet of wildflowers, and he looked handsome in his clean shirt and pressed pants. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. As Sarah spoke her vows, she found herself truly listening to the words for the first time. To have and to hold, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. She looked into Jeremy's steady eyes and saw not a master but a partner, someone who would stand beside her rather than over her. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, Jeremy's kiss was gentle and brief, a promise rather than a claim. Sarah felt something inside her chest that she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was. Hope. The small gathering of neighbors who'd attended the ceremony offered their congratulations, and several of the women made a point of welcoming Sarah to the community. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, Sarah felt like she might actually belong somewhere. That evening, back at the cabin, Sarah and Jeremy shared a quiet dinner by firelight. The atmosphere was peaceful but charged with the awareness that everything had changed between them. They were no longer strangers sharing a temporary arrangement. They were husband and wife, bound together by law, and hopefully in time by affection. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jeremy asked as they cleared the dishes together. "No," Sarah replied, and she was surprised to realize she meant it. "Are you?" "Not for a moment," Jeremy said, and the sincerity in his voice made Sarah's heart skip a beat. That night, Sarah climbed to her loft as she had every night since her arrival. But this time, Jeremy followed her partway up the ladder. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I want you to know that nothing has to change between us tonight, or any night, until you're ready. The loft is still yours for as long as you need it." Sarah looked down at him from the top of the ladder, this man who had shown her more kindness in a few weeks than she'd experienced in years. "Thank you," she whispered. But as she lay in her narrow bed that night, Sarah found herself thinking not about what she was afraid of, but about what she might be missing. Jeremy had proven himself to be gentle, patient, and trustworthy. Perhaps it was time to start taking the risks that came with building a real life rather than simply surviving. The next few weeks passed in a comfortable routine. Sarah continued to grow stronger, both physically and emotionally. The scars on her back faded to thin white lines, and the fear that had lived in her chest for so long began to ease. Jeremy never pushed or pressured her, but she was increasingly aware of his presence, of the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. One evening, as they sat by the fire reading, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. "Jeremy," she said quietly, setting down her book. He looked up from the farming journal he'd been studying. "Yes?" "I think," she took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I think I'm ready to be a real wife to you." Jeremy set down his journal and studied her face carefully. "Are you sure? There's no rush, Sarah. We have all the time in the world." "I'm sure," Sarah replied, and she was. "I trust you." The simple statement seemed to affect Jeremy deeply. He rose from his chair and extended his hand to her, and Sarah took it without hesitation. "Then come with me," he said gently. Jeremy led her to his bedroom, a space she'd never entered before. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large bed covered in quilts and a window that looked out over the mountain valley. He lit a single candle, filling the room with warm, flickering light. "We'll go slowly," Jeremy promised, and his hands were infinitely gentle as he helped her out of her dress. For the first time in her life, Sarah experienced what it meant to be truly cherished. Jeremy's touch was reverent, patient, focused entirely on her comfort and pleasure. When he saw the faded scars on her back, he traced them gently with his fingertips, as if trying to heal them with his touch. "Beautiful," he whispered against her skin, and Sarah almost believed him. The physical joining that followed was nothing like Sarah's previous experience of marriage. There was no pain, no sense of being used or taken. Instead, there was tenderness, patience, and a growing sense of connection that went far beyond the physical. Jeremy made love to her as if she were precious, as if her pleasure mattered as much as his own. Afterward, as they lay together in the candlelit darkness, Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of joy rather than pain. "Are you all right?" Jeremy asked, his voice full of concern. "I'm perfect," Sarah whispered, and she meant it. Jeremy pulled her closer, and Sarah settled against his chest with a sense of rightness that she'd never experienced before. This was what marriage was supposed to be, she realized. Not a prison, but a sanctuary. Not a battle, but a partnership. "I love you," Jeremy said quietly, the words barely audible in the darkness. Sarah's breath caught. She'd never heard those words spoken with such sincerity, such gentle certainty. "I love you too," she replied, and was amazed to discover that it was true. The months that followed were the happiest of Sarah's life. She and Jeremy fell into a rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship that felt as natural as breathing. The homestead prospered under their combined efforts, and Sarah found herself taking pride in their achievements. She learned to handle a rifle and helped Jeremy hunt for meat during the harsh mountain winter. She became an expert at preserving food and managing their supplies to last through the long months when travel was impossible. She discovered strengths she'd never known she possessed and talents she'd never had the opportunity to develop. The community gradually accepted her as one of their own. The other women included her in their informal network of mutual support, and Sarah found herself forming the first real friendships of her adult life. She helped deliver babies, nursed the sick, and contributed to the countless small acts of cooperation that kept the isolated mountain settlement functioning. But it was her relationship with Jeremy that truly transformed her. Under his patient love and unwavering respect, Sarah blossomed into the woman she'd always had the potential to be. She grew confident in her opinions, assertive in her needs, and generous in her affections. The frightened, broken woman who'd stepped off the stage months earlier was replaced by someone stronger, happier, and more complete. One spring morning, nearly a year after her arrival, Sarah was working in her garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked up to see two men riding toward the cabin, and something about their bearing made her uneasy. Jeremy emerged from the barn, his rifle casually held but ready. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he watched the strangers approach. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Jeremy called out when the riders were within speaking distance. The older of the two men dismounted and approached with an air of authority that Sarah found familiar and disturbing. "I'm looking for a woman named Sarah Cox," he said. "I'm told she might be in these parts." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She hadn't used that name since leaving the East, but she recognized the type of man speaking. Someone with authority, someone who might have the power to take her back to the life she'd fled. "Don't know anyone by that name," Jeremy replied calmly, but Sarah could hear the steel in his voice. "She's about 22, brown hair, medium height," the man continued. "She ran off from her husband back east, and he's hired me to bring her back." Sarah's hands began to shake as she realized what was happening. William Cox had sent someone to retrieve her, to drag her back to the hell she'd escaped. The year of peace and happiness she'd built with Jeremy was about to be destroyed. "Like I said, don't know anyone by that description," Jeremy repeated. "You might try the next settlement over." The man's eyes narrowed. "I have reason to believe she's here." William Cox described her in detail, including some distinctive scars on her back from a recent accident. Sarah saw Jeremy's jaw tighten at the mention of her scars, the physical evidence of William's cruelty. She knew she should run, should hide, but her legs felt like lead. "Sarah," Jeremy called out, not taking his eyes off the strangers. "Come here, please." Sarah forced herself to walk toward them, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. When she reached Jeremy's side, he put a protective arm around her shoulders. "This is my wife, Sarah Murphy," Jeremy said firmly. "She's been here for over a year, and before that she lived with her family back east. I think you've got the wrong woman." The man studied Sarah's face intently, and she saw a recognition dawn in his eyes. "That's her," he said with satisfaction. "Sarah Cox, you're coming back with me. Your husband has legal rights, and he wants you home." "My name is Sarah Murphy," Sarah said, finding her voice at last, "and my husband is standing right beside me." "Your first husband is still alive," the man replied coldly. "That makes this marriage invalid. You're coming back to face charges of desertion and adultery." Jeremy stepped forward, putting himself between Sarah and the bounty hunter. "The lady has told you her name. She's not going anywhere." "I have legal authority to take her back," the man insisted, his hand moving toward his gun. "Don't interfere, or you'll face charges as well." "What legal authority?" Jeremy demanded. "Show me your papers." The man hesitated, and Sarah realized he might be bluffing about his official status. "William Cox hired me to bring back his wife," he said. "That's authority enough." "Not in Colorado territory, it isn't," Jeremy replied. "And I'd be real careful about reaching for that gun. You're on my property, threatening my wife, and I have every right to defend her." The tension stretched taut between the two men, and Sarah could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. The second bounty hunter had dismounted and was moving to flank Jeremy, clearly preparing for violence. "Jeremy, Sarah said quietly. "Maybe I should go with them." "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." "You're not going anywhere," Jeremy replied firmly, never taking his eyes off the men facing them. "This is your home, and no one is taking you from it." "Sarah Cox," the first man said, "you can come quietly, or we can take you by force. Either way, you're coming back to face your husband and the law." "My husband is dead to me," Sarah said, finding strength in Jeremy's unwavering support. "He lost any claim to me the day he first raised his hand against me." "A man has the right to discipline his wife," the bounty hunter replied coldly. "The law supports that right." "Not this law," said a new voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Morrison riding up the trail, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The sheriff was a fair man who'd always treated her with respect during her time in the community. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sheriff Morrison asked as he dismounted. "These men are trying to take my wife back east against her will," Jeremy said. "They claim to have legal authority, but they haven't shown me any papers. The sheriff turned to the bounty hunters. Well, let's see your documentation. The first man reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Sheriff Morrison examined it carefully, his expression growing more skeptical with each line he read. This isn't worth the paper it's printed on, he said finally. It's not an official warrant, just a private contract between you and this William Cox. You have no legal authority to take anyone anywhere. She's still his wife, the man protested. She ran off and left him. She's married to Jeremy Murphy now, the sheriff replied. I performed the ceremony myself. Whatever happened back east is no concern of Colorado territory law. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. She was safe. The law was on her side, and Jeremy was beside her, solid and protective. Now I suggest you gentlemen move along, Sheriff Morrison continued, before I decide to arrest you for trespassing and making threats. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, clearly realizing their mission had failed. The first man folded his useless document and shoved it back into his coat. This isn't over, he said to Sarah. William Cox doesn't give up easily. It's over, Jeremy said quietly, but with such cold finality that both men took an involuntary step backward. And if either of you ever come near my wife again, you'll answer to Mama. The threat was delivered in a conversational tone, but there was something in Jeremy's eyes that made it clear he meant every word. The bounty hunters mounted their horses and rode away without another word. After they disappeared down the trail, Sheriff Morrison turned to Sarah with a concerned expression. Are you all right, Mrs. Murphy? He asked kindly. I am now, Sarah replied, leaning into Jeremy's protective embrace. If they come back, or if anyone else shows up asking questions, you send word to me immediately, the sheriff instructed. No one has the right to take you anywhere against your will. After the sheriff left, Sarah and Jeremy stood together in their dooryard, watching the dust settle from the departed horses. Sarah felt shaky with reaction, but also strangely liberated. The confrontation she'd been dreading for months was over, and she'd emerged victorious. Are you really all right? Jeremy asked, his arm tightening around her. I'm better than all right, Sarah replied. I'm free. That evening, as they sat by their fire, Sarah found herself thinking about the woman she'd been when she first arrived in Colorado territory. Broken, frightened, carrying the physical and emotional scars of William Cox's cruelty. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a half-remembered nightmare. Do you ever regret answering my letter? She asked Jeremy. He looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression serious. Never, he said firmly, not for a single moment. Even when those men showed up today, even knowing that my past might bring trouble to your door. Jeremy set aside his work and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa they'd built together from pine logs and cushions stuffed with down from their own geese. Sarah, he said, taking her hands in his, your past made you who you are. It gave you strength, courage, and compassion. It taught you to value kindness and to fight for what matters. I wouldn't change a single thing about your journey because it brought you to me. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. I love you so much, she whispered. And I love you, Jeremy replied, pulling her close. My brave, beautiful wife. As Sarah settled against Jeremy's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she thought about the scars that still marked her back. They would always be there, faint reminders of the darkness she'd survived, but they were no longer sources of shame. Instead, they were proof of her strength, evidence that she'd endured the worst and emerged victorious. The seasons turned, and Sarah's life in the mountains settled into a rhythm of contentment she'd never imagined possible. She and Jeremy worked side by side to improve their homestead, adding rooms to the cabin, expanding their livestock, and cultivating more land for crops. Their partnership deepened with each passing month, built on mutual respect, shared goals, and growing love. Sarah discovered talents she'd never known she possessed. She became skilled at hunting and tracking, able to provide meat for their table when Jeremy was occupied with other tasks. She learned to read the weather patterns of the high country, to predict storms and prepare for the harsh mountain winters. Most importantly, she learned to trust her own judgment and to speak her mind without fear. The community fully embraced her as one of their own. When the school teacher moved away, Sarah volunteered to take over the education of the settlement's children. She found joy in teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic to the young minds eager to learn. The older women of the community sought her advice on everything from difficult births to preserving food, recognizing her wisdom and practical skills. But it was in her marriage to Jeremy that Sarah found her greatest transformation. The love between them grew deeper and stronger with each passing day, built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect that nothing could shake. Jeremy never tried to control or diminish her. Instead, he encouraged her to grow into the fullest expression of herself. One autumn evening, nearly 2 years after her arrival, Sarah was preparing dinner when she felt Jeremy's arms slip around her waist from behind. She leaned back against his chest, savoring the simple pleasure of his touch. "I have news," she said quietly. "Good news or bad news?" Jeremy asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Good news," Sarah replied, turning in his arms to face him. "The best news." Jeremy studied her face, and she saw the moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. "Sarah," he whispered, "are you—" "I'm with child," she confirmed, her voice filled with wonder and joy. Jeremy's face lit up with such happiness that Sarah felt her heart overflow. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure joy. "When?" he asked when he finally set her down. "Spring," Sarah replied. "The baby should arrive in late April or early May." Jeremy cupped her face in his hands, his expression tender. "Are you happy about it?" "I've never been happier about anything in my life," Sarah said truthfully. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Sarah bloomed under Jeremy's loving care. He insisted on taking over the heavier chores, though Sarah continued to teach school and help with the lighter tasks around the homestead. The other women in the community rallied around her, sharing advice and preparing for the arrival of the newest member of their close-knit group. As winter deepened into the coldest months, Sarah and Jeremy spent long evenings by the fire, planning for their child's future. They talked about names, about the values they wanted to instill, about the kind of life they hoped to provide. Sarah found herself marveling at how different this pregnancy felt from anything she'd ever imagined. There was no fear, no dread of what might come. Instead, there was anticipation, joy, and the absolute certainty that this child would be welcomed into a home filled with love. One snowy February evening, as they sat reading together, Jeremy looked up from his book with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What's that?" Sarah asked, setting aside her own reading. "About your scars," Jeremy said gently. "About what they represent." Sarah instinctively stiffened, though she knew Jeremy meant no harm. They rarely spoke about her past anymore, the wounds having healed so completely that they seemed to belong to another lifetime. "What about them?" she asked carefully. "I want our child to know about them," Jeremy said. "Not the details of how you got them, but what they mean. I want our son or daughter to understand that their mother is the strongest, bravest person I've ever known." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Jeremy, I mean it, Sarah. Those scars are proof that you survived something terrible and came out stronger. They're evidence of your courage, your determination to build a better life. Our child should be proud to have a mother who refused to be broken." Sarah reached for Jeremy's hand, squeezing it tightly. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "We both got lucky," Jeremy replied. "We found each other when we needed each other most." The baby arrived on a warm May morning after a labor that was long but not overly difficult. Sarah held her daughter for the first time as the sun streamed through the bedroom window, and she felt a love so fierce and complete that it took her breath away. "She's perfect," Jeremy whispered, his finger gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. "What should we name her?" Sarah asked. They'd discussed many names over the winter months, but now, looking at their daughter's peaceful face, Sarah knew there was only one choice. "Hope," she said softly. "Her name is Hope." Jeremy smiled, understanding immediately. "Hope Murphy," he said, testing the name. "It's perfect." As Sarah nursed her daughter for the first time, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain, the fear, the desperate flight to an unknown future. All of it had led to this perfect moment, this complete happiness. The scars on her back were still there, faint white lines that would never completely fade. But they no longer represented shame or victimization. Instead, they were proof of her strength, evidence of her refusal to be destroyed by cruelty. They were part of her story, but they no longer defined her. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who brought endless joy to the mountain homestead. She had Jeremy's steady temperament and Sarah's quick intelligence, along with a fearless spirit that sometimes worried her parents. By the time she was walking, she was exploring every corner of their property, always under the watchful eyes of parents who understood the value of both freedom and safety. Sarah found motherhood to be everything she'd hoped and more. Watching Hope discover the world around her, seeing everything through fresh eyes, reminded Sarah daily of how beautiful life could be. The simple pleasures of teaching her daughter to identify wildflowers, to gather eggs from the chickens, to help in the garden, filled Sarah with a contentment she'd never imagined possible. Jeremy proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving in his interactions with Hope. He built her a small chair so she could sit beside him while he worked, made toys from scraps of wood, and told her stories about the mountains and the animals that lived in them. Sarah often watched them together and marveled at how naturally kindness came to Jeremy, how instinctively he understood what Hope needed. When Hope was 3 years old, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news brought not just joy, but a sense of completion, as if their family was becoming exactly what it was meant to be. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in the spring they welcomed a son they named Thomas, after Jeremy's father. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. The homestead prospered under their continued efforts, and they were able to help other families who were just starting out in the territory. Sarah continued to teach school, though now she often had Hope and Thomas with her, the other children delighting in helping care for the youngest members of their community. One summer evening, when Hope was 5 and Thomas was toddling around on sturdy legs, Sarah found herself standing on the porch watching her family. Jeremy was teaching Hope to whittle, his large hands guiding her small ones as she carefully shaped a piece of pine. Thomas was playing with wooden blocks Jeremy had made, building towers and knocking them down with squeals of delight. The scene was so perfectly peaceful, so completely right, that Sarah felt her heart swell with gratitude. This was the life she'd dreamed of during those dark months with William Cox, though she'd barely dared to hope it might actually be possible. "Mama, look," Hope called out, holding up her whittling project. "I made a bird." Sarah examined the small, roughly carved figure with appropriate seriousness. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. What kind of bird is it?" "A brave bird," Hope replied solemnly. "Like you, Mama." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Jeremy had been true to his word about teaching their children to see strength where others might see vulnerability. Hope knew nothing of the specific details of Sarah's past, but she understood that her mother was someone who'd overcome difficulties to build their happy life. "All birds are brave," Sarah said, kneeling down to Hope's level. "They have to be, to soar so high." "Will you teach me to be brave like you?" Hope asked. "You're already brave," Sarah replied, pulling her daughter close. "You just have to remember to use your courage when you need it." That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Jeremy sat together on their porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of the wildflowers that grew in abundance around their home. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't answered my advertisement?" Sarah asked. Jeremy considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think I would have lived a decent life, but a lonely one. I would have had my work, my land, but not the joy that comes from sharing it with someone you love." "And the children," Sarah added softly. "And the children," Jeremy agreed, Sarah. "I can't imagine life without them now." Sarah leaned against Jeremy's shoulder, feeling utterly content. "I used to think that surviving was enough," she said. "Just getting through each day without being hurt was all I could hope for. I never imagined I could have all this." "You deserved all this and more," Jeremy said firmly. "You always did." Sarah thought about the woman she'd been when she'd first stepped off that stage, broken and afraid, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and the hope that things might be better in Colorado territory. That woman could never have imagined the life Sarah now lived, the love she'd found, the family she'd built. The scars are almost gone, she said, running her hand over her back where the faint lines were barely visible now. The ones on your skin, maybe, Jeremy replied, but the ones on your soul healed long ago. You're not the same woman who arrived here all those years ago. No, Sarah agreed. I'm not. That woman was a survivor. This woman is truly alive. As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas began to cry softly from inside the cabin. Sarah rose to tend to him, but Jeremy caught her hand. I love you, Sarah Murphy, he said quietly. I love the woman you were, the woman you are, and the woman you are still becoming. And I love you, Sarah replied, my partner, my protector, my dearest friend. She kissed him gently before going inside to comfort their son. As she nursed Thomas in the rocking chair Jeremy had made for her, Sarah looked around at the home they'd built together. Every piece of furniture, every improvement, every small comfort had been chosen and created with love. This wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary, a place where love lived and flourished. Years continued to pass in peaceful contentment. Hope grew into a confident young girl who could ride, shoot, and track as well as any boy in the territory, while still maintaining the gentle compassion Sarah had tried to instill in her. Thomas developed into a sturdy, cheerful boy who followed his father everywhere, eager to learn the skills needed to work the land. Sarah and Jeremy added a third child to their family, a daughter they named Grace, who had Jeremy's calm temperament and Sarah's quick smile. The homestead expanded to accommodate their growing family, with additions that Jeremy built with help from their neighbors. The same community cooperation that made life possible in the harsh mountain environment. Sarah's role in the community continued to evolve. She served as midwife, teacher, and informal counselor to women facing difficulties. Her own experience with hardship made her uniquely qualified to offer both practical help and emotional support. She never spoke directly about her past, but somehow other women sensed that she understood suffering in a way that made her advice particularly valuable. One day, when Hope was 12 and beginning to ask more pointed questions about her parents' past, Sarah decided it was time to share more of her story. She chose a quiet afternoon when Jeremy was working in the fields and the younger children were napping. Hope, she said, setting aside her mending, I want to tell you something about my life before I came to Colorado. Hope looked up from the book she was reading, immediately sensing the seriousness in her mother's tone. What is it, Mama? Sarah chose her words carefully, wanting to convey the important lessons without burdening her daughter with details too harsh for her young mind. Before I married your father, I was married to someone else, Sarah began, a man who was very cruel to me. He hurt me not just with words but with his hands. I had to leave him to save my own life. Hope's eyes widened with shock and anger. He hurt you, but why would anyone hurt you? Some people hurt others because they're angry and they don't know how to handle their anger properly, Sarah explained. Some people think they have the right to control others, especially women. But they're wrong. No one has the right to hurt another person. What did you do? Hope asked. I ran away, Sarah said simply. I answered your father's advertisement for a wife, and I came here to start a new life. It was scary, because I didn't know if your father would be kind or cruel, but I knew I had to try. Hope was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Were you afraid of Papa at first? A little, Sarah admitted, but your father showed me through his actions that he was different. He was patient and gentle and kind. He helped me heal, not just my body, but my spirit. Is that why you're so strong? Hope asked. Because you survived something terrible? Sarah smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. Partly, but real strength comes from choosing to keep loving, keep hoping, keep building something good, even after bad things happen to you. Anyone can become bitter and angry. It takes real courage to stay open to joy. Hope nodded solemnly, and Sarah could see her daughter filing away this lesson for future reference. I'm glad you were brave enough to come here, Hope said finally. Otherwise, Thomas and Grace and I wouldn't exist. I'm glad too, Sarah replied, pulling Hope close for a hug. You three are the greatest joys of my life. That evening, Sarah told Jeremy about her conversation with Hope. He listened thoughtfully, then nodded his approval. She's old enough to start understanding these things, he said, and she needs to know that her mother is someone who refused to accept less than she deserved. I want all our children to understand that, Sarah said. I want them to know that they should never settle for being treated badly, and they should never treat others badly either. They'll learn by watching us, Jeremy said confidently. They see how we treat each other, how we handle disagreements, how we work together. That's the best education we can give them. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. Their children were growing up in a home where love was expressed through actions as well as words, where problems were solved through discussion rather than force, where both parents were valued and respected. It was the kind of childhood Sarah had never had, but had always dreamed of providing. As the years passed, Sarah occasionally received news from back east through letters that found their way to the territory. She learned that William Cox had died in a saloon fight, drunk and alone, and she felt nothing but pity for the man who'd wasted his life on anger and cruelty. The news confirmed what she'd known for years. She'd made the right choice in leaving, in refusing to accept a life of misery as her fate. When Hope turned 16, a young man from a neighboring homestead began paying her attention. Sarah watched with mixed emotions as her daughter navigated her first romance, proud of Hope's confidence and good judgment, while also feeling protective of her innocence. She's growing up, Jeremy observed one evening as they watched Hope and her suitor sitting on the porch talking quietly under the stars. Too fast, Sarah replied, though she was smiling. She'll make good choices, Jeremy said confidently. We've taught her to value herself and to expect to be treated with respect. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. Hope had grown up seeing a marriage based on partnership and mutual respect. She would never accept less for herself. As Sarah approached her 40th birthday, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of contentment. The frightened young woman who'd fled an abusive marriage seemed like someone from another lifetime, though Sarah carried the lessons of that experience with her always. The scars on her back had faded to barely visible lines, but they remained as reminders of her strength and resilience. When younger women in the community faced difficulties, Sarah sometimes shared her story as encouragement, showing them that it was possible to overcome even the darkest circumstances. You saved my life, she told Jeremy one evening as they sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. You saved your own life, Jeremy replied. I just provided a safe place for you to heal. We saved each other, Sarah said, taking his hand. I gave you a family, and you gave me a home. The best trade I ever made, Jeremy said, squeezing her fingers gently. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life well lived. She'd survived the worst that life could offer and found her way to the best. The mail-order bride who'd arrived in Colorado territory, carrying nothing but hope and determination, had built a legacy of love that would endure for generations. The marks on her back had healed, but the strength they represented would live on in her children and grandchildren. A testament to the power of courage, the importance of hope, and the transformative nature of true love. Sarah Campbell Murphy had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she belonged.